What is love and why it apparently always does it seem to be overshadowed by sexuality and fetishes? Now, if we are to discuss on the topic of love, well, welcome to my YouTube channel, a place where I discuss on different topics, usually about introspection and from time to time game design. The point about this video is to dive a bit into a topic that many people use nowadays but seem to have little to no idea on what this topic of love actually is. So we've seen in a lot of mainstream movies the point of love, and it always appears as something highly physical. Now, mainstream is usually something that I see as very shallow because their music and the mainstream movies usually present this topic of love as nothing else than a shallow aspect of at most kissing and probably hugging, but there is little to no depth in it. It's just a codependency, put it one way or another. This is always gonna come from a very uh, ignorant way of being, or let's put it as unconscious way of being, because ignorant may sound a bit harsh for some people to swallow. But ultimately, the truth will set you free. It's just that at first it might actually piss you off. Now, love is something that people feel that is somewhere out there, like, the coronavirus, right? People say love is in the air. Well, ultimately, love is not in the air. It can be said that it is somewhat in the ether because it's always an external source. Love is not something internal. Now, many people may feel that love comes from the internal, and in many cases it may feel so physically, because when someone falls in love, they feel that their body is somewhat heating itself, and well, they might end up feeling, somewhat positive vibes, right? Now, this occurs due to a long range of, chemical reactions that occur in the body. And these reactions, well, hormonal reactions, are basically chemistry. So, to a certain extent, from a physical standpoint, love is kind of a chemical hijack. Now, we may be already knowledgeable on why it is chemical, because hormones and literally everything that is biology is, well, deeply related and linked to chemistry, but why necessarily hijack? Well, obviously, because when people so called fall in love, they can't think about anything else. And usually, this is because, well, it is an impulse. When an impulsive behavior triggers, it automatically overrides everything else, including other, you know, impulsive behaviors which are of a lower priority, or let's say, yes, of a weaker impulse. The point is, if someone is mainly a smoker, right, when they feel a need to smoke, that is an impulse. That impulse will come over, will override literally all other impulses like self-preservation. Because honestly, you're, overwriting your self-preservation. You're consuming something which you kind of know it's detrimental to your health, but you're still doing it because you cannot override the impulse. So the point is, when some people manifest that as sexuality, for example, right, when sexuality is their main impulse, they can't take their minds off of anything that is sexual. Now, unfortunately, most people end up believing that love equals sex, and well, this always ends up as possession because, well, ultimately, when people, in most cases, when they say they love you, they basically mean they want to own you. Why? Well, because when an impulse kicks in, the result or the target of that can only be impulsive, right? It is an impulsive want. It is the same principle that advertisements use. They always present you a product or a service and they give you an impression, albeit a very impressive one, or let's say a very imposing one, which really convinces a lot of people that without that object or that service, right, their life would suck. Hence why consumerism is still very powerful. Because if you keep people in survival mode, especially through religion and other structures and pillars of society, The point is, people will act in impulsive ways, and advertisements usually create a non-existent problem in your head, which the products or the service that they promote apparently will solve. So if you're seeking to solve a problem that doesn't exist, well, that's kind of being a little nutcase, right? So that's the same point with impulses. An impulse means a false realization of something, or, well, let's say, better said, a realization of something that doesn't exist. You suddenly have a problem, right? And many people live by this problem. They feel that they want to necessarily have sex, they want to experience certain fetishes, they want to be around someone, right? But usually that ends up with a quick fuck or something like that, and then they kind of run away from the other person because, well, being shallow, right? Being ignorant means that you're not gonna pay your energies any respect. That is why so many people end up surrounding themselves with other people who don't. If you don't respect your own energies, well, you won't respect anyone else, and you'll be just a shallow being who, well, will always run away from responsibilities because you can't be a shallow being and assume responsibilities at the same time. Sure, you can be shallow in some approaches, yes, no one is perfect, but when it comes to responsibilities, that is what shows you the greatest proof of one's maturity, right? If someone may be shallow, let's say emotionally, but professionally still handles responsibilities well, that is still a sign of, professional maturity. But when it comes to emotions, right, they may still be childish because children aren't yet, versed in the art of assuming responsibilities, right? This can be due to certain blockages that occur due to emotions not being given, right? Not being accorded to them as per need. Because each individual, based on their own karma, their own structure, right, they require more or less attention. Some children may require more attention, some children may require less attention. However, the energy they receive from their parents and from other people is kind of what they kind of need, right? It's what they need, and if they receive less of it, they will end up, you know, believing that they are somewhat not worthy of themselves, right, of attention and the such, and this will have serious influences because once such things trigger, then there are certain problems. Once this triggers, you have a person whose self-esteem kind of lowers. The more you lower, you will allow yourself, right, to become more easily confused. When you are confused, you will always look for external sources, and most likely your parents and your friends, your teachers, school in general, and the such aren't the best sources for that, for building back your esteem, because school kind of teaches you that whatever you do, it's never good enough. Your parents have been taught that same way, so most likely they will indirectly acquaint you to this idea, right? And if you follow some people who have gladly accepted this and live by this as if it is their Bible, right, you're probably gonna end up living life just like them. Because ultimately, a parent to a child is like a god, right? The parent is always wiser, the parent is always more knowledgeable. At least that's how the survival impulses of the child make them work, right? This is part of the physical body's existence and programming, not necessarily an aspect of the child. Because when a person behaves in impulsive ways, right, in ignorant ways, they will always run away from their discernment. Or when their discernment would try to trigger itself, right, people will always reject it because it triggers a lot of confusion. And people don't know how to handle confusion. Confusion means that something within you is breaking, right? A belief that you once held, right, and were probably even proud of it, no longer works. That is why you are confused by it, right? The very simple fact that it's putrefying, let's say, or its energies are being dispelled, right? Its mainframe is being dispelled. The point is, the lack of structure in there is, causing some, let's say, reactions, right? And a result of that is a energy type which people may recognize or, let's say, feel as confusion, right? When you no longer have a certain pillar, you kind of feel a bit shaky, right? And this can also be perceived as confusion. The point is, when you feel confusion, one should actually celebrate because you have finally diluted and, well, at least partly eliminated something which wasn't actually um, helping you, right? So it's basically part of your liberation because liberation ultimately means an escaping from all the karmic structures, right? And your personality is a sort of karmic structure. Love is also another sort of karmic structure because living all the kisses and hugs you want, those ultimately are nothing else than physical needs. If you are also raised in this world, most likely people run away from that, so you are met with little to none of those. So, with little to no affection, many people will react to that, right, in negative ways. They will feel unworthy, and in some cases, there is also always a split. Some people will feel they are unworthy, so they will, you know, entomb themselves in the prison of the mind, preferring to overdo things even to the detriment of others, right? In order to run away from the responsibility of doing something to improve their situation, right, and prove themselves that that is just nothing else than an illusion. Or some people will simply become the opposite. They will overdo something else. They won't do physical things, right? They will tend more towards emotional and psychological fulfillment. They will probably end up, uh, having sex with multiple people, right? Because if they perceive that they are not worthy of attention, right? They are not worthy of having sex with other people, they will end up as prostitutes, right? Not all prostitutes end up like this, but it is a very powerful psychological pillar, right? There are a lot of cases in which a woman ends up in such a nasty situation, not because she really is looking, because she would be looking for sexual pleasures, but it is a good way to actually earn the money that is needed, for example, for her own physical existence as well as the existence of their own children, right? Because, well, it is kind of hard to live as a woman in this world, especially when you have children. Now, the point is, since people don't know how to understand their emotions and their psychological and, well, other dimensions of life, the point is they will always perceive love as something, shallow. They Most people believe that love means, the man has to kneel before the woman and, ask her hand. They always have to bring the ring, right? It's always all these structures, right? Because these structures offer a sense of, survival. Because the comfort that they bring feels as a medicine to the need for survival, right? It feels like a cure for the need for survival that people live in, right? All these fixed structures, right, that so many societies have built and nurtured throughout time, ending up in a lot of karma, right? Nowadays, which is kind of hard to remove. You see people acting the same way people would act, hundreds of years ago, because, well, that's what actually karma means. A highly solid structure, right? Made of memory, which has been repeated so many times that people can no longer perceive it than, the bit of meaning that it actually is. Because all memory means nothing else than a meaning attached to it. By giving up that meaning, you liberate yourself from that, and finally you are free. It no longer influences you, though, this liberation doesn't come easy, right? Especially since you have um, reinforced this karmic structure. Now, when it comes to love, the point is many people see it as, just this aspect of, physically being close to someone else. But they are actually doing instead of being, because to be simply means to just be, right? You are there, only living in the present. But many people are just doing, right? They are doing love instead of being love. Because when you do love, you're only in a vibration of neediness, right? You're only needy. You need love, right? You need validation more than actually love, because when you realize that you no longer need validation from others, you finally realize that you can actually move closer and closer to love. Now, self-love is a lie because the self is just a creation, right? It is just an accumulation of thoughts, ideas, emotions, and literally everything that this world can offer, right? And your discernment, to a certain extent, has been used to, portray this, right? And, create certain thoughts, ideas, patterns in your existence to support your needs, right? So the point about self-love, this is one of the greatest traps that New Age spiritualists have created, either as an agenda to, prevent real waking up from occurring and, keeping people stuck in their mind while at the same time giving them the impression that they are awakened. The point is, you don't need to love yourself. I made a video on this, why you shouldn't love yourself, right? Why you shouldn't trust yourself, trust your talents instead. The point is, don't love yourself, because if you speak it slowly, it is called yourself. It is yours, but it is not you, right? It is a creation that you took part in creating, right? Because you had all the impulses, all the nudges around, all the opinions and points of view and, sources from the exterior, which some of them you accepted and you created, right? The scaffolding for your personality. But a personality is basically a mask that you can no longer take down because it is stuck to your face. So if you call that mask a means of freedom, to represent who you are, that's only a slave tool, right? A tool of slavery to support that which you think you are instead of that who you truly are. And when people act through such masks, right, they can only view love as a necessity. You need the other person, you are not welcoming them in your life. That is why so many people are miserable. They are always in this competition to change the other person, right? They are two empires trying to colonize the other one's capital, right? They are trying to terraform the other person into a tool that can suit their agendas, right? Because when you are in survival, you can't care for other people. Put it whatever you want, struggle against this truth however you want, but when you are in survival, everyone else is nothing but a tool that can help you in your survival, right? The point is, when the ship is sinking, everyone will make use of other people for their own survival at first. When their own survival is met, right, they will also start caring more and more for the others, right? But the point is, when you keep people living like animals, right, in survival mechanisms, they won't ever care for others. They will be disconnected from their emotions and their discernment, which is exactly what society needs to keep people, separated. And the point is, as that happens, it's easy to, conquer everyone because, well, separated one falls, right? So the point of love is viewed as everything else than selfless. When you love someone, it is a completely different point when you try a, let's say, fetish with someone. You can try a fetish with someone from a need to experience that fetish, or technically when you say need, you're basically a slave of that impulse, right? You can't live your life without that impulse, without the feelings that that impulse gives you, right? The execution of that impulse would give you, right? Because, well, people go through fetishes impulsively because, well, a fetish is basically nothing else than an impulse, right? Because fetish means an impulse. And in many cases, yes, it is sexual, and, well, people want that pleasure that sex will give them. Some want to be abused, some want to be the abusers. In both cases, they are both slaves to their own impulses. So none of them is independent or strong. It's just an opinion that they have. So the point is, one can try such fantasies from a more conscious point. Now, when you do something from a conscious point, there is a huge difference because you're no longer doing it in order to satiate an impulse of yours. You're doing that from a selfless point, right? You can tickle someone who's, let's say, handcuffed to a bed, but you're not doing that to please your own self, right? Because that's what a fetish is. You don't care about how ticklish the other person is or how well they feel. You just care that you're doing something that you feel very dependent upon, and, well, you're actually satiating your dependency upon a certain impulse, right? Upon the, actually better said, upon the emotional outcomes, right, of said impulses. So the point is, when you do that selflessly, what it means is you only care for the other person's well-being. Now, it doesn't mean that you will, you know, give yourself up, because that can also be another impulse. Some people are simply so lost in the impulse of giving themselves up to someone else that this is also another, very dangerous trap. The point is, in order to experience something selflessly, one has to simply detach from who they think they are. The point is, when you experience, fantasies with another person, you are indeed giving them some of your energy. But the point is, you simply exist in the present. You don't live in any impulse, you don't live in any point, because when you live in the present, okay, when you breathe in deeply and you live in the present, irrespective of what you're doing, there can be no failing to any impulse, because there are no impulses in the present. Impulses are only in the past, because you have created an attachment towards a situation that created a perceived problem to which you ended up with an impulsive mechanism, right? A mechanism that ensured your bypassing of that situation, right? You only bypassed it, you didn't solve the situation. So when that impulse occurs again, you will probably repeat the same thing because the previous time it went, right? It went correctly. So you bypassed it. You thought you succeeded, so you will do the same thing again and again, and that's why it is called a bad cycle, right? That's why impulses are nothing else than a bad repetitive cycle. They never help you, right? They're just coping mechanisms that you believe will help you in a certain situation. And a belief is accepting something without a necessity for proof, right? You don't have proof that the situation was dealt with, you just felt it was dealt with, right? So in many situations, feelings can also be shallow, right? Just because something is no longer perceived in a certain way doesn't mean it has necessarily changed. Remember, perception can be a very powerful tool, but at the same time it can also be a very confusing tool. Confusion occurs from not knowing yourself enough. Now, the point about doing something selflessly is you are doing that without any, let's say, not respect towards yourself, without any regard, okay, towards yourself. Let's call it something like devotion, when something else becomes greater than who you really are, right? What you are, what you think you are. Just like people who worship a certain temple, they will do any work regarding that temple, irrespective of how yucky it may be, irrespective of how disgrateful it may be perceived by others. But the point is, through devotion, something is far more important than who and what you think you are. So obviously those people will gladly do those things, right? That is why so many people didn't have much of a problem even committing, ultimate sacrifice in the name of the other's well-being, right? Because they were devoted to a cause, and that cause was more important. When the well-being of the other person that you live in, right, is more important than who you think you are, that is when you tend towards selflessness. Because at the same time, no impulse exists towards that, right? You are present, you are rooted, and you know that the well-being of the others can never ever be fulfilled through impulses. Because when you do such things impulsively, you automatically expect something in return. Because any impulsive action is done at the same time with an expectation for something in return. This goes very deep. I'm not going to discuss too much on this, but it always works like that. Every time a person impulsively does something, they do it only because they expect something in return. This is how, let's call it, the ego works. Now, the ego again is another beautiful invention to a certain extent, because it is used as, a excuse, right? Every time someone feels tempted by something and they do something, they always have these excuses, because these excuses are nothing else than a justification to preserve themselves in the comfort of the repeating cycle, right? They love the cycle because it gives them comfort. Something happens, they feel that they are somewhat endangered, and then they do something that is to their own detriment. They again feel that they have bypassed the problem, which makes them feel good, and they have a sense of accomplishment, right? And they are stuck in the cycle because they wouldn't want to try something else. It will happen again, right? Just like when the smoking comes, right? When the need for smoking comes, they will smoke, and well, they no longer need to smoke, so they feel okay, right? They have bypassed the cycle, they haven't solved the problem, but they feel good because they have, they are dependent on how the smoking makes them feel, right? And they no longer need to smoke for a while, so in that period of time they feel safe, right? It's the same thing that goes on with love. People do love impulsively because, well, you can't be impulsively. When you are, you cannot be impulsively, right? When you simply are, you just stay there, disconnected somewhat from who you think you are, and just looking at your own thoughts and patterns and emotions from a certain distance without putting any judgment and any more labels upon any of those, right? And when this happens, right, you finally start becoming more aware of, deeper things. And well, that's one of the steps, let's say, towards selflessness, or basically when the well-being of others becomes far more important. Let's say when trying, when hugging someone, you're no longer hugging them because you need hugs and you expect one in return. You're hugging them because, well, honestly, all that you want is technically nothing. You don't want anything because when you simply are, you don't want anything. Because when you are, you just are, right? When you do living, right, that's a little problem. Because when you do, when you're a human doing instead of a human being, you're living impulsively. So there is always that sense that something in your life is missing. So you have to, uh, you know, you constantly have to do something to avoid this idea of lack, right? But you're technically living in lack, so everything that you will do to bypass that lack is doing more of a lack, right? Because you're overdoing something to distract yourself from a real feeling of lack, right? But when you overdo something, you already live in a feeling of lack because you overdo something in order to distract yourself. And when you want to distract yourself, well, that's only a distraction. And a distraction is nothing else than running away from the responsibility. It's kind of hard for me to portray these things, through, simple words, but the point is, love has always to come from a selfless perspective, not from an aspect of want, because a question that I asked once was, how do you act when it comes to your friends and when you have to invite them into your house, right? Do you need them? Do you want them? Or do you simply invite them in, right? Because based on which of these three vibrations you, well, work with, right? Based on which of these you work well with, that shows how needy you are, right? When you want people, you just want them. It is priority that you invite them in, and well, technically they will be treated as slaves because, well, it's like you're a little narcissist who wants, their narcissistic supplies when you want someone. The same thing is kind of for needs, right? When you need someone, well, the need, in my perspective, feels a bit less than a want because a want is fully impulsive. When you need, you don't need something necessarily specific, right? You can use this or you can use that. You can make use of more people instead of just one. Now, these two are synonymous, but I, for some reason, perceive them a bit differently, right? But when you want something, it always feels more impulsive to me. When you need something, that's more, of a softer illusion. But the point is, when you welcome someone inside your own home, right? When you welcome them in, that is an aspect of inclusion, which is the wiser approach to conquest, right? Conquest is a need, because conquest is always triggered by a need. Inclusion can be triggered in a way by need, but you're no longer including things as much as tools, right? When you conquer, you always include those as part of, as tools in your own kingdom, right? In your own rulership. The point is, when you include, right, especially from an open minded perspective and from a sensitive perspective. You're conscious of the differences and you're willing to turn those differences into strengths of the new collective you have created, right? This may not fully work, but ultimately, helping others achieve the understanding, well, better said, the realization that differences are always a strength within a collective rather than having a collective of X individuals that just all think at the same time, in the same way. That will always be sensitive because a certain way of thinking can always be countered by many points. When everyone thinks in that same way, they all are susceptible to the same counters, right? When you have differences and you allow discernment to exist, that is when your regime will reign supreme because it is harder to combat, right? You have multiple views which have to be taken into account. It will take a longer time, but multiple views have always been more important. They have always brought more light to certain problems, right? All this being said, hopefully this video was, introspective enough and provided some eye-opening. You are appreciated. Take care of yourselves. Fair Engine Board signing out.